Good morning, everyone. So we are live on the Cincinnati Herald Facebook. It is about 11:08, so we're getting a little bit of a late start, but we're going to be here for a half hour, and we're here with Dr. Childs, and I am going to let Dr. Childs introduce himself.
Hey, folks, I'm David Childs. I'm a professor of social studies, education, and history at Northern Kentucky University. And I also do a weekly column blog for Democracy and Me, to Cincinnati Public Radio. And then got a book coming out, just finished it, called Escape from Home, a novel about slavery and freedom. It's a historical fiction novel. So that'll be coming out pretty soon. So I'm glad to be here. My area is in the African American we're going to be talking about today. So,
all right. So thank you again for coming and joining us. So today we are going to be reading a historical book. That's why I have a story in here. And I really just want to get some perspective on how we can, make some relationships and connections between what has happened in America's history and what's still happening now. How does that influence our culture? So it's kind of going to maybe seem like the same question a few times, just because I really want to know in these different aspects of this book, what reflections do you see between now and then? So the book we are talking about is called At the Dark End of the Street. This is it right here. So I know it's Halloween, but this is not a fiction book or a spooky story or anything like that. This is based off of history here in America, and this is a book about violence and aggression and some of the dark past that we don't really talk about here in America. So I really just wanted to start off specifically talking about the life of Rosa Parks and all that she did to push and fight for change in the 40s and beyond that. So this book, like I said, At the Dark End of the Street, focuses on Rosa Parks' role in history and how she pushed forward for women's rights and to push against brutality that was happening to Black women in the South. So in 1944, she was called to investigate a rape case in Alabama, the rape of Reese Taylor. And she was just one woman. Reese Taylor was one woman on a very long list of women who have been brutalized and abused by white men in the South and during this entire era. And there's also a documentary on Hulu called The Rape of Reese Taylor. So if you all want to know more specific details about that case, like I said, you can definitely read this book or get online and watch that documentary. But I want to dig into, what it does to a culture when one area or region is very violent against another demographic of people. So rape is a very sensitive subject, and there's a lot of terrible stories that have happened to women in this book. So we're not going to go into a lot of the details. Like I said, we really just want to talk about, how do we even get to a place where that sexual violence and that aggression was used as a, almost normal form of punishment or a form of, keeping people in their place. So on page 50, early in the book, there's a story about how Black people were constantly abused, even shot and killed by raging white bus drivers who were protected by segregation laws and white supremacy in the South. So, we are talking about women, but in that same breath, we're just talking about the dynamic of America in general and what was happening during that time. So what similarities do you see in society today that allow people that are in public service positions to get away with violent behavior? And do you think that's still a problem?
Yes, it's really, it's what the Me Too movement was all about. The Me Too movement really addressed the historical issues and challenges that women had when they rise to various positions of power or when they are subordinate under men of power, particularly in the Harvey Weinstein. And it was uncovered that in that case in particular, for decades, and even the allegations against Bill Cosby, people like that, and so many other men that for decades had been in Weinstein's situation, had been sexually harassing women and raping them and sexual battery, and using that as leverage and essentially all people high profile roles in film. And Lupita actually, her last name escapes me, from Black Panther, really
Nyong'o.
Yes. Say it again. Nyong'o. Thank you.
Now, I might not be saying it completely correct myself, but that's the last thing.
You remember.
Yeah.
There's an interview she did about how Weinstein approached her with for sexual favors and a Black woman, and promised her roles. And then she went to his house to talk about an upcoming role. This was before she had done Black Panther. And she was propositioned, and she said no. And when she said no, he informed her that he would never get any significant roles in society or in the film industry. And she said, well, you want to bet on it? And she went on to do Black Panther, and I think it was the James Go Unchained, and others like that. It might have been 12 Years a Slave, one of those movies. And after she became famous, he reapproached her like, I'm sorry that happened, that, it wasn't what you thought.
Wow.
Do you want to work with me still? So this is part of a long history. History is always having a conversation with the present. So what we expect, they always has a historical context. And yes, it goes on. And I want to say a little bit more about intersectionality, this notion that, what affects women in general is going to be even more profound with the Black community, the Black and brown community, in terms of these same things that we're talking about. So, yes, it's on today.
Okay. So my next question is going to lead us more into, this violent aspect of what's been happening in history. So in 1946, the National Committee Against Mob Violence was founded in America. So I had personally never even heard of this committee before reading this book. And I really am curious to know how many other people have heard of this organization. And I think it just goes to show and highlight how much Black people had to go through in order to be protected from violence, because those who were in power were not protecting us from this violence. And we had to constantly, dig into our own communities in order to try to find someone to stand up for us, whether it be Black women, Black children, or Black people. Our government was literally structured so that we felt unsafe. So that just goes to highlight, we didn't have a legitimate Civil Rights Act until 1968, but people have always been made, or Black people have been made to look like criminals, deviants. We are just constantly villainized in our mainstream media. So we were the ones that were actually being harassed and systematically oppressed within this time frame. So what does that do to a culture when people are seen as the bad guy when really they have been victimized?
Yeah, so can you repeat that question again? I'm sorry, say that again.
Sure. What does that do to a culture when people are falsely villainized for no reason and made to look like the bad guy when really they're victims?
Right.
Of oppression.
Gaslighting. That's the definition of gaslighting, and it still goes on today. Historically, with the legacy of white supremacy, it's the idea that people of European descent are superior over people of color, and that has so many historical ramifications present in that whole conversation in terms of the historical aspect and legacy of white supremacy. And so what that means is they get to do, the thought is that white males get to do anything they want to Black folks, and particularly the Black female body, which is one of the themes of the book. The does not own her body.
Yes.
Even as early as the auction block, when they Gutman talks about this historian in Gutman in his novel The Slave, his nonfiction text, The Slave Family, talks about how slave masters intentionally, it's called The Black Family in Slavery and Freedom, 1750 to 1925, how slave masters purposely purchased Black women, attractive Black women, young women, from the auction solely for the purpose of concubinage and to be sexual slaves for not only himself, but his teenage sons that were coming of age. So this goes back a long time ago, what we're even experiencing today. And to feel like your question had to do with just being made to feel like you're wrong when you know you're right. That's what organizations like the National Emergency Committee Against Mob Violence, who was made up of representatives from NAACP, the Urban League, the Federal Council of Churches. The Black church played a big role in these movements, the American Federation of Labor. Prominent individuals such as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, they were all members of the National Emergency Committee Against Mob Violence, as Asia mentioned, from 1946. And so these individuals took upon themselves to advocate for Black folks that were constantly being accused of something they did not do. And really it was a cover-up. It was a large-scale cover-up. And as and folks, when they get into the book, they'll find out that violence and rape and sexual violence was going on all through the South for decades, all throughout the 20th century. And nobody but God was defending these folks. These small towns, like in Recy Taylor's situation, where this was a matter of course. They could do whatever they wanted, it seemed like, with Black women. So and I hope that gets at your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it leads me to the next question, which is almost a little bit repetitive, but what does that do to the women of that culture? Because they feel unprotected, yet at the same time, you can see instances in the story where when the men try to protect those women, they're also threatened. Recy Taylor, she was assaulted at gunpoint, and there was a young man with her, but, there were several armed men who were attacking her. So had he tried to protect her, they would have killed her. So, what does that do to the women when they feel like, well, we have no source of protection because everything that we try to do will be harmed?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, my lens is historian, and I'm a theologian, and I'm an ordained minister, and so I come from those lenses. I'm going to always put everything in historical context. So just thinking about Recy Taylor's situation, being able, and they were coming back from church on top of that, and the story goes, there's a documentary on Hulu as well, which I just watched. Story goes that this group of thugs, we think about who the real terrorists are, by the way, and who real Black and brown folks are always labeled as thugs, but we think about the real thugs were the white men that for decades systematically raped and brutalized and terrorized these Black women. And so they had been riding around all night trying to find Black women, black girls that they can have their way with. And the first two they approached, they fought them off. So they kept riding around, and they saw Recy Taylor walking. And due to them, just the terror and just the fear of retribution, the fear of speaking up, is a part of the civil rights movement, the story that has been untold. It just, because it's always from a male perspective. And then I want to add another layer of history. The women's rights movement, the feminism, first, second, and third wave feminism. And it was really important to talk about that because feminism primarily dealt with this idea that women wanted a better place in the work. They wanted more power in the workplace. Okay, they wanted people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, some of the early feminists, and the suffragist movement, the suffragettes. They were fighting for women's equality, and particularly the issue of working, equal rights in the workplace. But we understand now as historians, particularly as a person that does African American history, that the feminist movement did not speak to the challenges, barely speak to the challenges of Black and brown women. it had white women in mind, because after a while, people didn't see Black folks as a person. So some of the early folks like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, they were very noble, and we don't want to downplay the work they did, but it largely ignored Black women that were already working. Okay, the issue of Black folks. We didn't have a choice. Black women didn't have a choice on whether they wanted to work. From early on,
right,
in slavery, they had to work, and so they couldn't say we want to go to the workplace. That was a white enterprise. Critical race theory talks about whiteness as property, and that basically talks about this idea that concessions aren't made for Black people unless they benefit white people. But anyway,
absolutely.
And so, in short, these women were being raped in the cotton field. So we can go, for me, the civil rights movement starts at slavery. And so because you had the seeds of abolitionist efforts, abolitionism, anti-slavery movements, the writing that Frederick Douglass did, the North Star, those early newspapers throughout slavery was a part of the civil rights movement. Even John Brown and his raid were early seeds of the civil rights movement. And so one of the things that was apparent when you read the slave narratives, they talk about the rape and the sexual assault, even on the plantation. And so guess what? During the 40s and 50s, this was nothing new. In Reese Taylor's situation, it was a part of a long trajectory of sexual violence against Black women. And you know what? Many of those guys were so-called Christian. There was so-called religious tone on it, which irks me, as a minister, because people were using religion to justify their lust and their sexual assault, because they looked at women, there was this whole thing about rape. So on one side, they wanted to protect white womanhood by fulfilling their sexual favors on the Black women. But at the other hand, there was this fear that the Black men will rape their women. And there's still that notion today when you see interracial couples and you see a Black male with a white woman, it makes everybody uncomfortable because these old racial tropes. So in short, the evil and the insidious nature of these Black women that are being sexually assaulted, they can't even speak up because of the system of white supremacy. And we still have vestiges of it today that we're challenging. And whether it's in the workplace, whether it's Black women trying to get tenure, trying to go through the tenure process in academia, whether it's women in position of power, and people call it, like I saw a sign the other day in Ohio that said, we can't elect, vote out Joe in the hoe. They were calling Kamala Harris a hoe. So there's this idea.
Oh my goodness.
Still this idea, and I hate to even repeat it. And all of the tropes that went on about Michelle Obama, there's still this idea that Black women are sexually promiscuous, and that they're not intelligent, and that they're ghetto and hood. That comes from slavery. It comes from this era that we're talking about today.
Absolutely. And I love how you really broke that down, because that was my purpose of having a historian as my guest today, because you really are able to connect those dots. I'm able to connect some dots as well, but I think on average, mainstream education doesn't teach us about a lot of these things. So, when they happen, they really just seem unrelated. They seem confusing. People can't necessarily understand, like, how did we get here? How did that happen? But it's all so related. And I just really want someone who can put into words, what that relationship looks like and how we end up here, so that, after this election, however it turns out, we can really take a better look at how our government is set up, what our government does to protect us, what our government has done in the past, and, how can we be involved so that in the future we never have these eras of terror, because I do think there's still a sense of fear that people have, especially Black women, that, violence can be put upon them at any time, and maybe, only maybe, there will be consequences for those actions. So that leads me into the story about Claudette Copeland. Some people are becoming more familiar with Claudette Copeland's story. Some people are not. Briefly, she was on the bus in 10th grade, and she had just gotten out of school, and she was learning about peaceful protest. She was learning about resistance, and she was learning her rights. So when this bus driver told her, hey, you have to get up out of your seat and stand in the aisleway in order for these segregation laws to stay in place, she refused. And she said, no, I'm not getting up. I don't have to get up. So long story short, police were aggressive with her. She was arrested, and there was a movement to call for change, once again, because things like this were happening all over the South. So I just want to read a short passage from the book. It is on page 90. And give me just a moment to find it here. All right. For starters, an unwed pregnant teenager might be a divisive symbol for a community where fissures of class, religion, and color already presented tough challenges. Her stomach was beginning to swell, Nixon argued, and her mother was ashamed to have her appear in public. So that's just a brief explanation to show you the context of the story. So once again, she was a 15-year-old little girl, and she was pregnant. This was in the 50s, and she was a dark-skinned little girl. So all of those things stacked against her are not going to, make her the ideal figure for what America thought was a person to represent, Black women or the Black race. And on top of that, I wanted to talk about how is it that Black women always have to check off all of these boxes in order to be seen as like a legitimate representative. I have to be, like you just said, if I'm ghetto, if I'm loud, if I'm this, if I'm that, then all of a sudden my opinion doesn't matter anymore, or what I'm saying doesn't count anymore. So how can we encourage teachers and educators to listen to listen to the youth and put them in a place where they're not villainized, for what they believe in, and how can we teach them to stand up for themselves?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, honestly, it has to do with training, teacher education training. One of my roles at Northern Kentucky University is to train teachers in really how to teach history and how to teach social studies education. Another role that I play, I teach a class with teachers on racism and sexism, and then also cultural competence, and getting to some work where we are training education majors on how to work with folks different from themselves. I think that's really, really important today because a lot of our schools are based on middle-class values and middle-class culture, white middle-class values, white middle-class culture. And so that means when they meet a person like me or you, because I'm from the inner city, I know every Black person is not from the inner city, but we have different diversity within our culture. From the rural, there's the whole Black rural communities that's under researched. Out in the country, there's a whole different culture with African American folks, Black and brown folks that are from, for example, myself, I'm from the inner city, and I don't always use standard English. That's no reflection on my intelligence. I know how to code switch, but teachers also, if I come at them in the way that I normally talk at home or with my friends, like, bruh, what's up with you, man? I still know how to speak. That no reflection on my intelligence. But when teachers see that, and that's what I experienced in school, they read me as deviant. They read me as a troublemaker or intelligent. Sometimes they'll put us in special education classes, or that's what happened with me often, where I would get stereotyped. And so in terms of helping teachers, I don't think there's any substitution for training and conversations with teachers about how to deal with folks like me and you, how to educate us properly in the classroom, and how to understand that just because I laugh loud doesn't mean I'm off task. Just because, I like a certain type of music, just because we listen to hip hop doesn't mean, we're violent with us, or I sing a lot, and I might go right into singing, and people will look like, why is he singing? Or some people, sometime when I was working at Aiken High School, I was teaching at Aiken High School, sometimes a kid would get up and just start dancing, in the middle of class while they were taking notes. We're off task. And so sometimes I would say, okay, at the end of class, y'all, we're gonna have a dance contest. The last 5 minutes, you gotta do your work, do your history work, We're supposed to
Right.
do, we're gonna have a dance contest, or we're gonna do freestyle. We used to freestyle in class. Just because, you know, those kinds of things doesn't. I think often this. I'm glad you put it in a historical context, because white behavior is deemed as right and black behavior is deemed as bad. And so speaking quietly and not being emotional is a Eurocentric behavior. That doesn't mean nothing wrong with that.
Right.
It's cultural. But what is wrong is when they make that the norm and make that right. And so anything we're laughing loud, or we're like, "What's up with you, man?" You know, at restaurants, you know, people looking at us. That's what we do. You know,
right.
Santi, you know, want the audience check out Ashanti's work. He talks about Afrocentrism, and it's a way of knowing from an African perspective. We do things differently. The way we think about things, the way we respond to things is sometimes different. And so teaching needs to know that. That's part of the problem. And you hit the nail on the head. I think a lot of the reasons why we're in this racial tension today in the political climate on the eve of the election is because history teachers have not done their jobs in K-12. In American history classes, we've been taught about honestly old white men, and that's a part of American history too. But you know what else is also a part of American history? African American history is American history. Black women's history is American history. Hispanic American American history. Native American history is American history. But if we in kindergarten all the way till 12th grade have been taught that the only important history of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Paul Revere, and I love those guys, I'm a historian, but if that's all we've been taught, then we're going to look at African American history as substandard, as just a comma in history. So we need to be educated. One of the things I want to do, one of the things I've been doing, I also do some teaching at Temple Bible College. I do a full year of African American history. One of the things I want to do, you know, up front, I want to do a podcast, a radio series on African American history, and we could partner or collaborate, because there's so much going on, so much that we need to do. Black studies, really my area is Black studies, African American history. It's my expertise, and so I really want to do some work and probably involve some of my students just on a regular basis, because we have catch-up work to do. That's what I say to my students. Like, we have a full year in Asia. We start before 1619. We go back to Mansa Musa, the ancient kingdom of Ghana, the ancient kingdom of Mali, the library of Timbuktu during the Middle Ages. We go back to 300 BC, even during the time of the Babylonian captivity. At the same time, Africans were kings and princes and wealthy. Mansa Musa was thought to be the wealthiest man that ever lived, and he was an African king. So these are the things that we need to play catch up on. Absolutely.
So that really does answer my last question, which was, do you think that history will repeat itself? You may have a more extended response, and I would love to listen. I just think that you really summed that up very well. You know, we need to learn our history. That's just the long, you know, the short and long end of the story. We need to learn our history. And I think the more we learn, the more we really can start to put these things together. And you automatically feel like you need to take action when you learn these things. You know, when you learn the history of what happened to the Native Americans, when you learn the history of what happened to African Americans, even when you learn the history of Africa before we were colonized and how powerful that nation or that continent is, it makes you want to take action. It makes you want to know more. It makes you want to change. So I think that if we really start taking a deeper look at history, we can connect some of these dots and then hopefully prevent, you know, any other eras of tragedies from taking place in this country. So I just want to thank you for your time. And actually, did you have any closing comments or thoughts on this story, or anything that people can check out on your blog that might give them some more context for what we talked about today?
Yeah, I think first of all, I want to thank you for this conversation. It's people like you. What you're doing is so important. Thank you. Hill talked about the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, and that was based on the title of Carter G. Woodson, the miseducation of the Negro. That's what they're getting at. This idea that we have so much catch up to do, as I said earlier, in terms of learning. You know, just start somewhere. History is broad. Studying history is broad, you know, and just speaking as a history teacher, it's a lifelong study, folks. And it's okay if you do something. Sometimes I'll have people in my class that are in their 60s that are just really starting that journey to reclaim their history. It's never too late to learn this history. I'm a lifelong learner myself. I invite you to just email me if you want, charlesd1@nku.edu, charlesd1@nku.edu. The reason I say that, I want to just continue the conversation, not in the way of self-promotion, but I'm a teacher by nature. I'm here to, my sort of call, I'm purpose-driven. You know, God put me here to teach and to have conversations with people and collaborate with folks. And so she mentioned the blog. It's on Democracy and Me. I've done a whole series of what Asia is talking about. I don't even know if she knew this, but I did a 5-part series on women's rights. And it deals with, there's one piece that I think you looked at, Black women's lives matter, but I did some earlier pieces, intersectionality, race and gender, understanding race and socioeconomics, how it affects women's lives and experience. Yes. And so basically race, class, and gender, you know, how it's different. The Black experience is going to be different. The Black and brown experience is going to be different. The Native experience is going to be different. And then I did a piece on the womanist tradition that you want to check out. Feminism is feminism, basically. And it deals with the differences in a Black woman's experience. Even if she's a wealthy person like Oprah, her experience is going to be different. We find that social class doesn't always trump race. People still, you know, some people say you're an N-word. To some people, you're an N-word no matter what you do. You know, prejudice and racism at my own college, and I'm a professor. And so I just want to thank you, and just keep learning, folks. Keep learning. Never stop. When you stop, my doctoral class, my professor used to always say, when you stop learning, you cease to grow and you cease being intelligent. So the most intelligent people always understand that there's always something that they can learn. And my favorite thing is look it up. So thank you. I just want to thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I've accidentally opened our video on another screen. So thank you very much for joining me today. Once again, I really appreciate it. I think it is perfect timing right now to have this historical perspective, someone who could really connect the dots, because I think there is a lot of, you know, cultural confusion about, you know, what's going on, how did we get here, why do people feel this way, etc. So you gave us some really great context, a really good head start on, you know, where we can just begin to find these small pieces of information. You know, you don't have to pick up the biggest book you see. You don't have to, you know, go deep into the rabbit hole. You know, just pick up one book. Just pick up one, you know, one article and see what you are interested in, you know, and see what that sparks you to do. So I appreciate your time. You have a happy Saturday. If you have anything planned for the Halloween, you have a safe weekend. And everyone else, y'all have a safe weekend too. And check us out at 6 o'clock tonight for our next episode of The Influencers.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.